Jonathan Roumie was about to speak 7 words that would change Oprah Winfrey's life forever, but neither of them saw it coming. She had just delivered what she thought would be the perfect blow to destroy the man who plays Jesus on television. The cameras were rolling, 12 million people were watching, and Oprah was confident she had him cornered with the cruelest question she could devise. But Jonathan's response would shock everyone in that studio. What were those 7 words that stopped Oprah cold? What could the man who portrays Christ possibly say that 3 major networks would later try to bury the footage? This is the story of the most explosive interview in television history, the moment when unshakable faith collided with a billion-dollar empire. And it all started when Oprah made the fatal mistake of challenging the wrong person on the wrong day. 3 weeks earlier, Jonathan Roumie was sitting in his modest Chicago apartment reading his morning prayers when his phone rang with an invitation that would test everything he believed. The voice on the other end belonged to Oprah's head producer, offering him a spot on what they called a spiritual enlightenment special featuring various faith leaders and spiritual teachers. Jonathan had heard about Oprah's ventures into spirituality, the expensive courses, the repackaged ancient wisdom, sold as revolutionary insights, the way she turned sacred traditions into profitable products. He almost declined, but something in his spirit told him this was where God wanted him to be. The apartment around him told the real story of his faith, walls bare except for a wooden crucifix. His Lebanese grandmother had carved a faded photo of his father, who had died thinking his son would never amount to anything, and stacks of theology books worn from years of study. His kitchen table was covered with letters from viewers of The Chosen People writing to thank him for showing them what authentic faith looked like in a world full of spiritual counterfeits. Jonathan had never sought fame, never chased fortune, and had turned down countless opportunities to monetize his portrayal of Jesus, but this invitation felt different, like a calling he couldn't ignore. As he prepared for the show, Jonathan researched Oprah's recent spiritual ventures and felt his heart break for the millions of people being sold empty promises, wrapped in beautiful packaging. Her Miracle Mindset masterclass cost $1,000 per person, promising to unlock divine abundance through visualization and positive thinking. Her partnership with various New Age teachers had created an empire worth hundreds of millions, all built on the idea that spirituality was something you could purchase and control. Jonathan knew he was walking into a trap, but he also knew that sometimes God calls his people to be lights in the darkness, even when it costs them everything. The night before the taping, Jonathan knelt on his apartment floor and prayed for wisdom, courage, and the grace to speak truth with love. He thought about Jesus overturning the tables in the temple, driving out those who had turned his father's house into a marketplace. He thought about the woman at the well, the tax collector, the thief on the cross, all the broken people who had found genuine hope in authentic relationship with God, not in expensive courses or secret formulas. Jonathan made peace with the possibility that this appearance might end his career, because some truths were worth telling, regardless of the cost. When Jonathan arrived at Harpo Studios the next morning, he was struck by the overwhelming opulence of the place: marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and walls lined with photos of Oprah with celebrities and world leaders. The green room was filled with other spiritual teachers, each one promoting their latest book or course, networking and discussing their marketing strategies with an enthusiasm that made Jonathan's stomach turn. He sat quietly in the corner reading his worn copy of the Gospel of Luke, while around him people discussed 7-figure book deals and speaking fees that could feed entire villages. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. A production assistant approached Jonathan with a clipboard outlining the questions Oprah would ask and coaching him on how to promote his brand. During the segment, "Make sure you mention any books, courses, or merchandise you're selling," she said with practiced efficiency. Oprah's audience loves spiritual content, and this is your chance to really capitalize on that market. Jonathan politely declined to review the suggested talking points, explaining that he wasn't there to sell anything. The assistant looked confused, as if she had never encountered someone who didn't want to profit from their spiritual platform. As the other guests took the stage before him, Jonathan watched from the wings as Oprah interviewed a series of spiritual entrepreneurs who promised everything from instant enlightenment to guaranteed prosperity. Each segment felt like a carefully choreographed sales pitch, with Oprah skillfully guiding the conversation toward products and programs her audience could purchase. The audience responded with enthusiasm, clearly hungry for hope and meaning, but being offered expensive substitutes instead of genuine transformation. Jonathan felt the weight of what he was about to face, knowing that his message of free grace and authentic relationship with God would be jarring in this context. When his time came, Jonathan walked onto the stage, wearing his father's old navy blazer and carrying nothing but his Bible. No promotional materials, no business cards, no agenda, except to speak truth. Oprah greeted him with her trademark warmth, but Jonathan could see the calculation behind her smile as she sized him up for the interview. The audience applauded politely, but there was an expectant energy in the room, as if they sensed something different. About this guest, Jonathan took his seat and quietly asked God for the words that would honor his name and serve these precious people who were searching for something real. Oprah opened with her usual approach, praising Jonathan's work on The Chosen, and asking about his spiritual journey in language that sounded profound, but remained safely vague. "Jonathan, you've touched millions of hearts with your portrayal of Jesus," she began, her voice carrying that practiced intimacy that had made her famous. "Tell us about the spiritual practices that have brought you to this level of consciousness." Jonathan paused, recognizing the New Age framework she was trying to impose on his faith. He knew this was his first choice: play along with her language, or speak the truth that might alienate her audience. "Oprah, I appreciate the question, but I think there might be some confusion." Jonathan replied gently, "I'm not interested in spiritual practices or consciousness levels. I'm interested in Jesus Christ, who is the way, the truth, and the life." The shift in the room was palpable. Oprah's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, and several audience members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't the inclusive, universal spirituality they had expected. Jonathan continued, "Everything I do flows from my relationship with the living God, not from techniques or practices that I've mastered." Oprah recovered quickly, her media training kicking in, as she attempted to steer the conversation back to safer territory. "That's beautiful, Jonathan. And of course, there are many paths to the divine, many ways to connect with that universal love and wisdom that you call Jesus." Her words were carefully chosen to make his specific faith claim sound like just another option in the spiritual marketplace. But Jonathan had spent years studying theology, and he recognized the subtle way she was trying to dilute his message. He also recognized that this moment would define everything that followed. "Actually, Oprah, I have to respectfully disagree," Jonathan said, his voice remaining calm but firm. "Jesus said, 'I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me.' That's not one path among many. That's the only path." The audience was completely silent, now sensing that something significant was happening. Oprah's expression hardened slightly, the warmth in her eyes replaced by something sharper and more calculating. She had built an empire on the idea that all spiritual paths led to the same destination, and Jonathan had just challenged the foundation of her entire worldview. "Jonathan, surely you don't mean to suggest that billions of good spiritual people around the world are wrong about their beliefs?" Oprah's tone remained controlled, but there was an edge to it now. "Isn't that kind of exclusive thinking exactly what's wrong with organized religion?" The question was loaded, designed to make Jonathan look narrow-minded and judgmental in front of her audience. But Jonathan had faced this challenge many times before, and he knew the difference between speaking truth and being cruel. His response would either open hearts or close them, and he prayed for wisdom in that crucial moment. Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his voice filled with genuine compassion. "Oprah, I would never call anyone a bad person because of their beliefs, but truth isn't determined by sincerity or good intentions. It's determined by reality." He paused, looking out at the audience with the same gentle expression he wore when portraying Jesus. "If my house is on fire and someone sincerely believes that water won't put it out, their sincerity doesn't change the fact that I need water to save my home." The analogy was simple but powerful, and Jonathan could see some audience members nodding in understanding despite the uncomfortable tension in the room. Oprah's mask was beginning to slip, now her frustration with Jonathan's refusal to conform to her spiritual framework becoming more apparent. "But Jonathan, don't you think it's arrogant to claim that your religion is the only true one? What about all the wisdom traditions that have helped people for thousands of years?" Her voice carried a patronizing tone, as if she were gently correcting a child who didn't understand the sophisticated nuances of adult spirituality. The audience began to murmur in agreement, some clearly uncomfortable with Jonathan's exclusivity claims. But Jonathan had been preparing for this moment his entire life, even if he didn't know it. "Oprah, I'm not claiming that my religion is true. I'm claiming that Jesus Christ is true." Jonathan replied, his voice growing stronger. "There's a difference. Religion can become just another product to sell another way to make people feel better about themselves without actually changing their hearts." His words hit the room like a physical force, and Jonathan could see Oprah's eyes narrow as she realized he was talking about her empire. The audience was completely silent, now hanging on every word of what had become a theological wrestling match with enormous stakes. Jonathan knew he was about to cross a line that would change everything. "The Jesus I follow didn't come to start a religion or build an empire," Jonathan continued, his voice filled with quiet passion. He came to seek and save the lost, to offer forgiveness to sinners, to give hope to the hopeless, and he did it all for free. No courses, no levels, no secret knowledge that only the enlightened could access. The words hung in the air like an indictment. Of everything Oprah had built, she sat rigid in her chair, her public persona wearing with her private rage at being challenged, so directly the cameras captured every micro-expression, every moment of her carefully controlled composure. Beginning to crack, Oprah decided to go for the kill, leaning forward with the predatory instinct that had made her one of the most powerful people in media. Jonathan, let's be honest about something. You've made millions of dollars playing Jesus in a television show. Isn't it a little hypocritical to criticize others for monetizing spirituality when you've built your entire career on it? The attack was swift and personal, designed to expose him as a fraud and regain control of the narrative. The audience perked up, sensing blood in the water. But Oprah had just made a fatal mistake. She had attacked Jonathan's integrity. Without knowing the truth about his life, Jonathan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper worn from handling Oprah. You're absolutely right to question that, he said calmly. In fact, I brought my financial statements for exactly this reason. He held up the paper toward the camera. This is my bank statement from last month. My balance is $1,847. I give away everything except what I need to survive. The audience gasped audibly, and Oprah's face went pale. This wasn't in her research, wasn't part of the narrative she had prepared to destroy him with. Jonathan continued, I live in the same apartment I've had for 8 years, drive a 15-year-old Honda, and eat most of my meals at home because that's all I can afford. The revelation sent shock waves through the studio, but Jonathan wasn't finished. You see, Oprah, when Jesus called his disciples, he told them to take nothing for the journey. No money, no extra clothes, no security. He said that anyone who wants to follow him must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow him. His voice grew more passionate, more urgent. That doesn't mean everyone has to be poor, but it does mean that our treasure should be in heaven, not in building earthly empires. The words hit Oprah like physical blows, each one exposing the vast difference between her prosperity gospel and the radical teachings of Christ. Oprah's composure was cracking now, her voice rising with barely controlled anger. That's easy to say when you're getting all the attention and adoration for playing the most famous figure in history. Don't lecture me about humility when you're literally making a living pretending to be God. The outburst was unprecedented. Oprah Winfrey, the queen of media composure, losing control on her own show. The audience sat in stunned silence as they watched their beloved host reveal a side of herself they had never seen, but Jonathan remained completely calm, as if he had been expecting this moment all along. Oprah, I'm not pretending to be God, Jonathan said quietly. I'm pretending to be a man who claimed to be God and was willing to die for that claim. There's a difference. He paused, letting the words sink in, and the attention and adoration you mentioned, most of it comes from people who are desperate for hope, for meaning, for someone to tell them they're loved unconditionally. The same people who come to your shows looking for the same thing. The parallel was devastating, and Jonathan could see the recognition dawning in Oprah's eyes. She had built her empire on people's spiritual hunger, but she had been feeding them expensive substitutes instead of the bread of life. The tension in the studio was suffocating as Oprah realized she was losing control of her own show. Her audience was listening to Jonathan with the kind of attention usually reserved for her, hanging on his words as he spoke about faith with an authenticity they rarely encountered. You know what I think, Jonathan, she said, her voice dripping with venom. I think you're a religious fanatic who's using people's faith to make yourself feel important. I think you're dangerous. The attack was desperate, now a wounded predator lashing out at the threat to her territory. But Jonathan's response would be the moment that changed everything. Jonathan stood up slowly, and the entire studio seemed to hold its breath. Oprah, 3 days ago I got a call from a little boy named Michael in Detroit. He's 7 years old, and he's dying of leukemia. His voice was steady, but filled with emotion. His mother told me that he watches The Chosen every day in his hospital bed, and that it's the only thing that gives him peace. She asked if I could talk to him just for a few minutes. The audience was completely silent, now sensing that something profound was about to happen. Even Oprah sat frozen, her anger replaced by a growing sense of dread. Michael asked me if Jesus really loves little boys who are sick, if heaven is real, if his mommy and daddy will be okay when he dies. Jonathan continued, his voice breaking slightly. I told him yes, Jesus loves him more than he can imagine, that heaven is more beautiful than any place he could dream of, and that his parents will see him again someday. Tears were starting to flow in the audience now, and even some of the camera operators were visibly moved. Jonathan looked directly at Oprah. Then Michael asked me something that broke my heart. He asked if the lady on TV who talks about God really knows Jesus, or if she's just pretending because she seemed sad when she smiled. The words hit Oprah like a sledgehammer, and for the First time in the interview, she was completely speechless. A 7-year-old dying child had seen through her carefully constructed facade with the clarity that only innocence possesses. The audience began to murmur, some crying openly, as they recognized the truth in the child's observation. Jonathan continued, I told Michael that only God knows what's in someone's heart, but that he should pray for everyone who talks about God on television, because it's a big responsibility. The simplicity and innocence of the story was devastating in its power to expose the difference between authentic faith and spiritual performance. Oprah's hands were shaking. Now her usual confidence completely shattered. That's emotional manipulation, she stammered, but her voice lacked conviction. She looked out at her audience and saw something she had never seen before. People looking at her with disappointment, even pity. They were seeing her clearly for the first time, and she didn't like what they were discovering. Jonathan shook his head sadly. No, Oprah, that's just a little boy who knows the difference between someone who loves Jesus and someone who uses Jesus. Children can see things that adults often miss because their hearts haven't been clouded by pride and ambition. The studio was so quiet that the hum of the cameras seemed loud. Jonathan reached into his other pocket and pulled out his phone. Oprah, Michael is watching this show right now from his hospital bed. His mother texted me this morning to tell me he was excited to see Jesus on TV with the pretty lady who helps people. He held up the phone so she could see the message. Would you like me to call him so you can tell him yourself that his faith is just wishful thinking, so you can explain to a dying 7-year-old that Jesus is just one path among many, and that his hope might be misplaced? The challenge hung in the air like a sword over Oprah's head. Oprah's face went white as the full implications of the moment hit her. Here was a child facing death with faith and hope, and she had just spent the last 30 minutes attacking the very foundation of that hope. The audience was watching her with a mixture of expectation and growing horror as they realized what was being asked of her. I can't, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The admission was devastating. The woman who had built an empire on helping people couldn't bring herself to crush a dying child's faith, even though she had been trying to destroy that same faith in millions of adults. Jonathan's voice became incredibly gentle, filled with the compassion of someone who understood both the weight of truth and the pain confronting it. Oprah, I don't think you want to hurt Michael or anyone else for that matter. I think you genuinely want to help people find hope and meaning. He paused, looking at her with the same expression Jesus wore when he looked at the rich young ruler who walked away sad. But somewhere along the way, I think you started believing that you could improve on what Jesus offered, that you could package it better, make it more palatable, more profitable. The words were like a surgical knife cutting through years of self-deception and rationalization. The problem is, Jonathan continued, when you try to improve on perfection, you always end up with something less. When you try to make the gospel more appealing to everyone, you end up with something that saves no one. His voice grew stronger, more urgent. Jesus didn't come to make us feel better about ourselves. He came to make us new. He didn't come to validate our choices. He came to change our hearts. And he didn't come to make us rich. He came to make us righteous. Each word was like a hammer blow against the foundation of Oprah's spiritual empire, and she sat frozen as her worldview crumbled in real time. The audience was completely transfixed, many of them crying as they recognized the truth in Jonathan's words. These were people who had spent years and thousands of dollars pursuing spiritual enlightenment through Oprah's programs, and they were beginning to understand that they had been chasing shadows while the substance stood right in front of them. Jonathan looked out at them with infinite compassion. You don't need to buy truth, he said gently. You don't need to earn love. You don't need to achieve enlightenment. Jesus offers all of these things freely to anyone who will come to him with empty hands and an open heart. Oprah finally found her voice, but it was broken and desperate. But what about all the people I've helped? What about all the lives that have been changed through my work? The questions were plaintive, the cry of someone whose entire identity was being dismantled. Jonathan's expression softened even further. Oprah, I'm sure you have helped people. Kindness is always good. Encouragement is always valuable. But helping people feel better about their circumstances isn't the same as helping them find eternal purpose. Inspiring people to believe in themselves isn't the same as introducing them to the God who created them. The question isn't whether you've done good things, Jonathan continued. The question is whether you pointed people to the one who is good. Have you led them to the source of all hope, or have you become a substitute for that source? The distinction was crucial, and as it landed, Oprah's face crumpled as she realized the answer. For decades, she had positioned herself as the provider of hope, wisdom, and spiritual insight. She had become the destination rather than the signpost, the answer rather than the guide to the answer. The recognition was devastating. The silence stretched on as Oprah wrestled with the implications of Jonathan's words. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she asked the question that would change everything. What if you're right? What if I've been wrong about everything? The vulnerability in her voice was shocking. This was Oprah Winfrey, one of the most powerful people in the world, admitting the possibility that her entire life's work might have been built on a foundation of sand. The audience held its breath, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented in television history. Jonathan's response was immediate and filled with hope. Then the same grace that saved a broken actor from New York can save a media mogul from Chicago. The same Jesus who forgave the woman at the well can forgive anyone who comes to him honestly. He took a step closer to her chair. Oprah, the beautiful thing about Jesus is that he doesn't require you to have it all figured out before you come to him. He meets you exactly where you are, takes all your brokenness and mistakes, and makes something beautiful out of them. The offer of grace hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in the ocean of their own making. And then it happened, the moment that would be replayed millions of times across social media and talked about for years to come. Oprah Winfrey, the queen of daytime television, stood up from her chair and walked over to Jonathan Roumie. Without saying a word, she knelt down beside him, tears streaming down her face as decades of pride and self-reliance crumbled away. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "I don't know how to stop being in control." The admission was devastating in its honesty, and the audience watched in stunned silence as their larger-than-life life host revealed herself to be as broken and needy as any of them. Jonathan knelt down beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "That's exactly where Jesus wants you to be," he said softly. "At the end of yourself with nowhere else to turn. That's where all of us have to start." He looked out at the audience, many of whom were crying openly. Now Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." He was talking about people who recognize their spiritual bankruptcy, who understand that they have nothing to offer God except their need. The words were revolutionary in this context. The idea that weakness was actually strength, that poverty of spirit was the first step toward true riches. Oprah. Jonathan said, his voice filled with tenderness, "Would you like me to pray with you?" The question was simple, but it represented everything: the surrender of control, the acknowledgement of need, the first step toward authentic relationship with God. Oprah nodded, unable to speak through her tears. As Jonathan began to pray, something extraordinary happened in that studio. The pretense fell away, the performance ended, and for the first time in Harpo Studios history, real worship began to take place. "Jesus," Jonathan prayed, "here is your daughter Oprah. She's tired of trying to be strong enough, smart enough, successful enough. She wants to know you, not just know about you." The prayer was simple and honest, without the flowery language or manipulative techniques that characterize so much televised spirituality. As Jonathan prayed, Oprah began to sob, not the careful, controlled tears of someone performing grief, but the raw, ugly crying of someone whose heart was breaking open. She was mourning the years of building walls instead of bridges to God, of selling spiritual products instead of sharing spiritual truth. The audience watched in amazement as their hero revealed herself to be as human and needy as they were, and many of them began to pray along. When the prayer ended, Oprah remained on her knees for a long moment, as if afraid to return to the reality of her empire, built on shifting sand. Finally, she looked up at Jonathan with eyes that held something they hadn't contained in decades: genuine humility. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. Jonathan smiled with the gentleness of someone who had walked this same path from pride to grace. "Now you learn to walk with Jesus instead of trying to improve on him. Now you discovered that being his daughter is better than being your own God." The transformation was visible. The hardness had left her face, replaced by the softness of someone who had finally stopped fighting. As the show came to an end, there was no music, no dancing, no celebration, just the quiet awe of people who had witnessed something sacred. Oprah stood slowly, her legs shaky from the emotional earthquake she had just experienced. She looked out at her audience with new eyes, seeing them not as consumers of her spiritual products, but as fellow travelers in need of the same grace she had just received. "I don't know what this means for the show, for my business, for anything," she said honestly, "but I know I can't go back to pretending I have all the answers when I've just discovered I've been asking the wrong questions." The admission was courageous, and the audience responded with gentle applause, not the enthusiastic cheering of entertainment, but the respectful acknowledgement of truth. In the days that followed, Oprah made a decision that shocked the entertainment world. She announced that she was ending her spiritual empowerment courses and dismantling the commercial empire she had built around New Age spirituality. "I've been selling people what they wanted to hear instead of what they needed to hear," she said in a simple video message. "I've been pointing them to themselves when I should have been pointing them to their savior." The financial cost was enormous. Hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue disappeared overnight, but for the first time in decades, Oprah experienced the peace that comes from aligning your life with truth instead of profit. 6 months later, a small news story appeared that most media outlets ignored, But that brought tears to Jonathan's eyes. Oprah had quietly started visiting children's hospitals, not with cameras or publicity, but simply to sit with sick children and their families. She would read them stories, pray with them, and share the hope she had found in Jesus. One of those children was Michael from Detroit, who had lived much longer than doctors expected, and who told everyone that Miss Oprah found Jesus too, just like me. The ripple effects of that day in the studio continued to spread, touching lives in ways that no amount of money or fame ever could. Oprah's transformation wasn't without cost. She lost business partnerships, fair weather friends, and the adoration of those who preferred their spirituality without substance, but she gained something infinitely more valuable, a real relationship with the God she had spent years repackaging for mass consumption. When asked about her dramatic change, she would simply say, "I thought I was successful. When I had everything I wanted, I discovered I was successful. When I wanted what God wanted." The simplicity of the statement belied the profound journey from self-worship to God worship that it represented today. Both Jonathan and Oprah continue their work, but with a different foundation and a different purpose. Jonathan still portrays Jesus on screen, but with an even deeper understanding of the grace he represents. Oprah still influences millions, but now she points them toward the true source of hope instead of positioning herself as that source. Their encounter that day in the studio became a watershed moment, not just for them, but for everyone who witnessed it. A reminder that no one is too powerful, too successful, or too far gone to experience the transforming power of authentic faith. The video of their exchange has been watched over 500 million times, not because it was sensational, but because it was real. In an age of spiritual confusion and commercialized hope, people hungry for truth recognized it when they saw it. Comments poured in from viewers around the world who said that watching Oprah surrender gave them permission to surrender their own pride and pretenses. The most powerful testimony came from a woman who wrote, "I saw the most successful person I knew admit she needed a savior. If Oprah can humble herself before Jesus, maybe I can too." The story of that day continues to ripple outward, changing lives in ways that no expensive course ever could. Sometimes the most profound transformations happen not when we finally get all the answers, but when we finally admit we've been asking the wrong questions. If this story stirred something in your heart, then perhaps it's time to ask the same question Oprah asked. What happens now? The answer is beautifully simple. You take the next step toward the one who has been waiting for you all along. Arms open, grace ready, love unlimited. If you believe that some truths are worth standing up for no matter the cost, hit that subscribe button and share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and tell us in the comments what would you have said to Oprah in that moment.